In 2021, a Chinese submersible called Fendouzhe went to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Then it went back 33 times. It surfaced with sediment, water, and animals from between 19,700 and 35,800 feet down. And when the results were published 4 years later, they contained a number that should be more famous than it is. Of the microbial species they identified down there, 89.4% had never been described by anybody. Roughly 9 out of every 10 living things they brought up were unknown to science. Unknown in the strong sense. No name, no description, no entry anywhere. And that is the part of this story that keeps getting left out. We have been going down there for 150 years, and the honest summary is that we have sampled a few square miles of a habitat that covers nearly half the depth range of the ocean, and almost everything in it is new. This is what is down there, from the surface to the bottom, and what changed in the last 2 years. To understand how little we know, it helps to know how we started. In 1872, a British ship called HMS Challenger left Portsmouth on a 4-year voyage to survey the world ocean. It was a converted warship with most of its guns removed to make room for laboratories, and it is the reason oceanography exists as a science at all. The method for measuring depth was a rope with a weight tied to the end. You lower it over the side, you pay out line, and when the line goes slack, you have touched down. Then you haul it back in and count. That is agonizingly slow work. A single deep sounding could take most of a day, with the crew hauling wet rope hand over hand. In March 1875, southwest of Guam, they let the weight go and it did not stop. They kept feeding out rope. It kept going. When it finally touched down, they had paid out more than 7 kilometers of line. They found the lowest point on the planet with a rope by accident, and they did not know what they had found. They wrote down the number and sailed on. The spot is still named after that ship, Challenger Deep. The seafloor is on average about 2.5 miles down. The Mariana Trench goes to nearly 7. Something is making that hole. The Earth's outer shell is broken into plates, and the plates carrying the oceans are made of denser rock than those carrying the continents. When 2 of them meet, the denser one loses. The Pacific plate is being pushed westward, and where it runs into the Philippine plate, it does not crumple upward into mountains. It bends downward and slides underneath back into the hot mantle it came from. Geologists call it subduction. The reason the plates move at all is heat. The mantle underneath them is rock hot enough to flow, slowly, in vast circulating currents, and the plates ride on top of that circulation like scum on a simmering pot. It's not fast. The Pacific plate moves at a few inches a year, about the rate your fingernails grow, and it has been doing it for tens of millions of years. That slowness is why the geometry works out the way it does. If the Americas are drifting west away from Europe and Africa, then they must be closing on Asia and Australia from the other side. Something has to give, and what gives is the ocean floor in between. It gets consumed. This is not happening in one place. The rim of the Pacific is a nearly continuous chain of subduction zones, volcanoes, and earthquake belts running from New Zealand up past Japan, across the Aleutians, and down the entire west coast of the Americas. The Ring of Fire, roughly 3/4 of the world's active volcanoes sit along it, and so do most of its largest earthquakes. Our trench is one segment of that rim, and it happens to be the deepest. The trench is the crease where that bend happens. It's not a canyon carved by water. It is the visible seam of one piece of the planet being swallowed by another, and it is being renewed constantly, which is why it does not silt up and disappear. The Mariana Trench is about 1,580 miles long and roughly 43 miles wide, which is a strange shape to hold in your head. It is a scar longer than the distance from New York to Denver, and at its deepest point, it could swallow Mount Everest with more than a mile of water still above the summit. And what surrounds it matters, because the isolation is part of the story. Head east from the trench and the seafloor climbs out of it and then flattens. and it stays flat for something like 7,500 miles of almost featureless abyssal plain before it rises again towards the Americas. Nothing in between, no ridges worth the name, no other trenches, nothing at Hadal depth at all. It is a slot cut into an otherwise empty floor, and for anything that can only survive below 19,700 feet. The next slot is thousands of miles away across ground that would kill it. And the pressure down inside that scar is the reason almost nothing we build can go there. Swim to the bottom of a swimming pool and your ears hurt. That is about 10 feet of water. In the Challenger Deep, the pressure is around 16,000 pounds per square inch, which is roughly 1,000 times what you are feeling right now at the surface. Numbers that size stop meaning anything, so here is the version that does. It is the weight of about 50 jumbo jets stacked on top of a single square meter, or in the comparison researchers themselves used, the equivalent of around 800 elephants standing on your body. Pressure is not the only problem either. The water is just about freezing. There is no light of any kind, and there is nothing to eat except what falls from above. That combination was, for most of the last century, considered a definition of uninhabitable. The objection was chemical rather than aesthetic. At that pressure, the reactions themselves stop working. Cell membranes deform under pressure. Proteins fold wrongly. Calcium carbonate, which is what shells and bones are made of, dissolves rather than forms. On paper, that place should be sterile. It is worth seeing what that pressure does to hardware because it explains why the exploration has been so slow. In 2014, an unmanned deep-sea vehicle called Nereus was working in the Kermadec Trench at around 6.2 miles down. It had already been to the bottom of the Challenger Deep 2 years earlier. Contact was lost, and debris came to the surface. It had imploded. At those pressures, when a hull fails, it does not crack and leak. It collapses inward faster than the material can respond, and the vehicle is destroyed in the fraction of a second. That is one of a handful of machines built to survive full ocean depth, and there have never been many. Before 2019, fewer than a dozen people had ever visited the deepest point of the Mariana Trench. More people have walked on the moon than have stood down there. We are about to go down one layer at a time, and the strangest things are not at the bottom. Subscribe and come with me. Before the descent, the people who have actually been there, because the list is shorter than you would guess. On the 23rd of January 1960, a Swiss engineer named Jacques Picard and a U.S. Navy lieutenant named Don Walsh climbed into a vessel called Trieste and dropped into the Challenger Deep. It was less a submarine than a balloon in reverse, a huge float filled with petrol, which is lighter than water and does not compress, with a small steel sphere slung underneath for the two men. The descent took nearly 5 hours. On the way down at around 30,000 feet, they heard a loud crack. An outer window had failed. They discussed it, could not see anything else wrong, and kept going. They reached the bottom, sat there for about 20 minutes, and looked out. And what Picard reported is the sentence that changed this field. He described a flatfish about a foot long, lying on the sediment and moving away from the light. That observation is why anybody believed life could exist at full ocean depth. It was cited for decades and is now genuinely thought to have been wrong. The consensus is that what he saw was almost certainly a sea cucumber, not a fish, because everything we have learned since says a flatfish cannot function at that pressure. So the founding observation of Hadal biology was probably a misidentification, and it happened to be right about the conclusion anyway. Then nothing for 52 years. Nobody went back. In March 2012, the film director James Cameron descended alone in a vessel he had helped design and became the first person to reach the bottom solo. He spent around 3 hours down there and brought back the first high-definition footage of the place. In 2019, an American investor named Victor Vescovo went and then went again and again. He is the reason the number of visits jumped. Before him, fewer than a dozen people had ever been that deep. and his expeditions made repeat dives routine enough that scientists could start treating the trench as a place to work rather than a summit to conquer. And in 2021, Vescovo and the British businessman Hamish Harding made the longest traverse ever done at full ocean depth, spending more than 4 hours moving along the bottom rather than simply touching it and coming back up. It is worth pausing on how odd that is. In the same period, 3,000 people climbed Everest in a single year, 650 went to space, and 12 walked on the moon. The deepest place on our own planet has had fewer visitors than the lunar surface. That is the entire history of humans down there. One dive in 1960, one in 2012, and a run of them since 2019. Start at the surface because everything below depends on it. Sunlight reaches down about 650 feet before it runs out. That thin skin is where photosynthesis happens, and the plankton living in it produce a large share of the oxygen on this planet. Every breath you have taken, roughly every second one, came from here. It is also where the food comes from. Everything alive before this layer is directly or indirectly eating something that grew in the sunlight. There is no other source, with one exception we will come to. The chain that starts here is the one everyone learns at school and almost nobody pictures at scale. Microscopic plants grow in the light. Microscopic animals eat them. Small fish eat those. Bigger fish eat the small ones. Sharks and tuna eat the bigger ones. And every link in it, all the way up, is powered by photons that arrive from a star 93 million miles away and were caught in the top 200 meters of water. So the entire ocean below is a system that runs on leftovers falling from the ceiling. Between 650 and 3,300 feet, the light fades to almost nothing. Enough gets through that your eyes would register a dim blue, not enough for anything to grow. This layer contains more fish than the rest of the ocean put together. Estimates of the biomass here have been revised upward repeatedly, and the best current figures suggest the twilight zone holds more fish by weight than every other part of the ocean combined. And almost nobody eats them because almost nobody has been able to catch them. The animals here run the largest migration on the planet every single day. At dusk, they rise toward the surface to feed in the dark, and before dawn they sink back down to hide. Hundreds of millions of tons of animals moving up and down twice a day, and it has been happening for as long as there have been fish. It also happens to be one of the largest carbon capture systems on Earth, because the animals feed at the surface and defecate at depth, physically carrying carbon down and leaving it there. Below 3,300 feet, there is no sunlight at all. Not dim. None. And yet this is where most of the light in the ocean is produced, because down here the majority of animals make their own. Bioluminescence is not a curiosity at these depths. It is the normal conditions. Estimates put the proportion of species that glow at somewhere around 3/4. It gets used for everything, attracting prey as the anglerfish does with a lure hanging in front of its mouth, attracting mates in a place where finding another of your species is close to impossible. And defense, including a trick where an animal releases a cloud of glowing fluid and leaves the predator lit up in the dark for something bigger to notice. Eyes change too. Many species here have enormous eyes for their body size, tuned to a narrow band of blue, because blue is the color that travels furthest in water, and therefore the color that everything down here signals in. Others give up on sight and switch to pressure. A line of sensors along the body picks up the movement of water displaced by anything nearby, which in total darkness is more useful than an eye. There's a pattern in the deep ocean that has been noticed for over a century and is still not fully explained. Animals get larger as you go down. The giant squid is the famous example, but the pattern holds across groups that have nothing to do with each other. Isopods, which are crustaceans related to wood lice and normally the size of a fingernail, reach over a foot long down here. Some deep-sea worms grow to lengths that would be impossible for their cousins in shallow water. The leading explanations involve cold, slowing metabolism, delayed maturity, and the fact that food arrives rarely enough that being large enough to store energy is an advantage. None of these fully accounts for it. The Japanese spider crab is the extreme case people know. A leg span of over 12 feet on an animal whose shallow water relatives fit in a hand. The giant isopod is the one that unsettles people more because it is unmistakably a woodlouse, and it is as long as a cat. It is the kind of pattern that is easy to describe and hard to explain, which is a reasonable summary of this whole field. Below about 13,000 feet, the water becomes remarkably empty. The particles drifting down from above, which biologists call marine snow, thin out to almost nothing. Marine snow is the entire economy of the deep ocean. It is dead plankton, fecal pellets, fragments of animals, and mucus drifting downward in a continuous fall that has been going on for hundreds of millions of years. Most of it gets eaten on the way down. What reaches the abyss is what nobody else wanted. So the animals here are built around waiting, and it shows in their bodies. Slow metabolisms, minimal muscle, and a general willingness to sit still in the dark doing nothing at all for weeks on end. The gulper seal, sometimes called the pelican seal, is the animal that makes the point best. Its jaw is longer than the rest of its skull and hinged so wide that it can engulf prey larger than itself, and its stomach stretches to hold whatever it manages to catch. It is built for the possibility that something edible drifts past once in a very long while and must not be missed. Almost every adaptation down here reads that way when you look closely. Not optimized for abundance, optimized for scarcity, and for the certainty that most of the time nothing at all is going to happen. There's one exception to the rule that everything runs on sunlight, and it is here. Around hydrothermal vents where seawater seeps into cracks in the crust and comes back out, superheated and full of dissolved chemicals, entire communities live on chemosynthesis instead. Bacteria that build sugars out of hydrogen sulfide instead of sunlight, and a whole community of animals living on those bacteria. That discovery in 1977 was one of the genuine shocks in the history of biology. A team looking for warm water off the Galapagos found clams and tube worms and crabs clustered around a vent in total darkness, thousands of feet below anything sunlight reaches, and nobody had predicted it. An ecosystem that does not need the sun. The vents themselves are extraordinary. Seawater percolates down into cracks in the seafloor, gets heated by the rock below, dissolves minerals out of it, and comes roaring back up at temperatures that can exceed 700 degrees Fahrenheit. It does not boil because at that pressure, water cannot boil. When it hits the cold ocean, the dissolved minerals crash out of the solution as a black cloud, and over years they build chimneys of metal sulfide that can grow taller than a house. The Mariana region has these too, along with something rarer, vents that release fluids so alkaline and so chemically unusual that they have been studied as a possible analog for where life on Earth began. The vents are the famous part of the deep ocean, and they cover almost none of it. Dramatic, photogenic, and geographically trivial. The rest of it, the enormous dark plain and the trenches cut into it, runs on the falling snow, and that is the system almost nobody looks at. Below 19,700 feet, the seafloor stops being a plain and becomes a set of trenches. This is the Hadal zone, named after Hades, and it accounts for roughly the deepest 45% of the ocean's depth range, while covering a tiny fraction of its area. And it is not a single place. There are around 37 separate trenches scattered mostly around the Pacific, each one isolated from the others by thousands of miles of shallower seafloor. That isolation was, for decades, the most interesting thing about them. And we will come back to it because that is the part that changed. Two things live here in numbers. The first is amphipods, small crustaceans that swarm anything edible that lands on the bottom. Drop a beta trap into a trench and you will pull it up carrying hundreds of them. The Hadal species Hydrothermal gigas has an enzyme system that lets it digest wood, which matters because sunken timber is one of the few reliable food sources that reaches these depths. The second is stranger. Xenophyophores are single-celled organisms that grow to 8 inches across or more. One cell the size of a grapefruit. They build fragile structures out of sediment particles and sit there, and they turn up in trench after trench. And there is a great deal about them that nobody understands. And then there are the snailfish, which are the reason this part of the ocean is interesting rather than just extreme. They're small, pale, translucent animals with broad fins and an eel-like tail, and they glide slowly over the bottom in a place where the pressure should have destroyed them. They manage it with a set of adaptations that read like a list of compromises. Their skeletons are thin and only partly hardened because heavy mineralized bone does not work at these pressures. Their bodies are largely water and gel, and their cells are packed with a compound that stabilizes proteins under pressure, in concentrations that rise the deeper the species lives. That last detail produced a prediction. If the compound is what makes deep living possible, and if its concentration has an upper limit, then there is a depth beyond which fish can go. The calculation put that limit at somewhere around 27,000 feet. In August 2022, a snailfish was filmed in the Izu Ogasawara Trench off Japan at 27,350 feet, the deepest fish ever recorded, and essentially exactly where the theory said the ceiling was. And there was a detail in that footage worth holding on to. The fish was not struggling. It glided slowly over the sediment while the pressure on its body was equivalent to 800 elephants, and it looked entirely unbothered, which is a rare thing in this field, a prediction about the deep ocean that turned out to be right. Now the part that is new and that changes the shape of the answer. Between 2021 and 2024, a Chinese program called MIR used the crewed submersible Fendouzhe to run 33 dives into the Hadal zone, mostly in the Mariana Trench, sampling sediment, water, and animals systematically across depths from 19,700 to 35,800 feet. The word that matters here is systematically. Almost every previous expedition went to the deepest point, took what it could reach, and came back. This one sampled across the whole system, which is the difference between visiting a mountain summit and surveying the mountain. The results were published in Cell in 2025, and the headline number is the one from the start of the video. More than 7,000 microbial species, and 89.4% of them were new to science. There was a second finding underneath that one which is arguably more interesting. The team could show that these communities are shaped by selection rather than by chance. The microbes down here are the ones the pressure and the cold and the chemistry selected for, and they have converged on the same two survival strategies again and again. Either strip the genome down to the essentials and specialize, or carry a large flexible genome and adapt. And the same adaptations show up in the animals, the amphipods and the snailfish, which are separated from those microbes by well over 1 billion years of evolution, are using recognizably similar chemical tricks to survive the same pressure. And here is the finding that overturns something this field held as settled, including in most of the videos you have seen about it. Every account of this, including ours until now, has described each trench as an island, isolated by thousands of miles of seafloor that is far too shallow for Hadal species to cross, each one evolving its own animals in its own private pit. Life adapted to that place and nowhere else. In September 2025, a genetic study of Hadal snailfish across multiple trenches found that it is not true. The same lineages turn up in trenches separated by enormous distances, which means they are not sealed off from each other at all. Something is moving between them, or has moved between them recently enough to leave the signature. The paper is direct about the consequence. The naming itself needs revisiting because species that were described separately from separate trenches may not be separate species. That is a bigger detail than it sounds. If the trenches are connected, then those depths are not 37 isolated experiments in extreme survival. It is one habitat with gaps in it, and the animals have found a way to cross the gaps that we have not identified. We do not know how they do it. Nobody does, And that is a gap in the field rather than in this video. Before the conclusion, the limitation, because it is the honest half of everything above. Almost all of what we know about the Hadal zone comes from one method. Lower a camera and some bait to the sea floor, leave it and see what turns up. It works. It has produced most of the footage you have ever seen of these animals, and it has built-in bias. It only ever shows you the scavengers. Anything that does not come to a dead fish does not appear. It also only shows the flat sediment plain where a lander can sit upright, which is a small fraction of the terrain in a trench that has walls, ledges, overhangs, and slopes. One of the scientists who has worked on this put the problem well. Studying a trench by sampling only its deepest point is like trying to understand a mountain ecosystem by looking only at the summit. There is a second bias nobody talks about, which is where the landers go. They go where a ship can sit safely and where the seafloor is flat enough to land on, which in practice means the same handful of sites revisited. The trench walls, which are the largest part of the structure, are almost entirely unsampled. And the scale of what has not been looked at is difficult to convey. The Hadal zone covers an area comparable to a continent. The total seafloor that has been directly sampled at these depths across all expeditions in history would fit inside a small town. So when the mere results came back saying that 9 out of 10 species were new, that result is exactly what you would expect from sampling a continent by taking a few dozen handfuls of it. So where does that leave the answer to what is down there? We know it is inhabited at every depth, right to the bottom. That was seriously doubted within living memory. It is now settled. We know roughly how the animals do it: thin skeletons, gel-like bodies, and a specific chemical that props up proteins against the pressure, with a concentration ceiling that appears to set a hard limit on how deep a fish can be. We know the ecosystem runs on what falls from above, with one exception around hydrothermal vents, and that everything down there is built around food arriving rarely. And we know 2 things we did not know 2 years ago: that the microbial diversity is an order of magnitude larger than the catalog suggested, and that the trenches are not the sealed islands we describe them as. What we do not know is almost everything else: how the animals move between trenches, what lives on the walls rather than the floor, what does not come to bait, and what proportion of the species down there we've actually met, which on current evidence is a number close to 1 in 10 than to 9. Go back to the rope for a second. In 1875, a crew of exhausted sailors hauled miles of wet line back onto a deck, wrote a number in a logbook, and sailed on without knowing they had found the deepest place on the planet. They had no way to see it and no way to reach it. 150 years later, we have been to the bottom repeatedly with cameras and sample tubes and crude submersibles. And the most recent systematic survey of that place came back reporting that 9 out of 10 living things there were new to science. That's not a failure. It is what the beginning of an exploration looks like from the inside, and the ocean floor is the last place on this planet where we are still at the beginning. And there is one other place where the same thing is true, where we have mapped the surface in detail and know almost nothing about what is underneath it. 2 miles of ice, with lakes and mountain ranges and river systems sealed under it that no light has reached in 15 million years. We made a whole video on what is hidden under Antarctica. Start there.